Good morning. And I have to say, it's a real pleasure to be speaking to all of you. As objectivists, you no doubt admire pride in Ayn Rand's heroes, in other works of art, in sculpture, in drama, for instance. Sometimes you get to admire pride in actual people around you, who you know. I'm sure that you also sometimes enjoy the feeling of pride. It's a bracing, clean feeling. When you feel proud, all seems right with the world, perhaps because all seems right with yourself. Yet many objectivists' understanding of pride as a virtue is shaky. Precisely how is it supposed to guide our actions? Of the several moral virtues that Ayn Rand identified, pride tends to recede into the background of our thinking. Pride seems more a description of an ideally virtuous person than a prescription for action. It doesn't seem as directly action-guiding as certain other virtues, like justice, for instance. Judge others objectively and treat them accordingly. Or independence, go by your judgment of reality, not other people's ideas. While you might frequently remind yourself about other virtues, you might say, okay, I've got to be sure to be honest here. I've got to slow down and be just here. When's the last time you reminded yourself, I've got to be proud? Now, some of you may do that, whether in those words or in some other terms, but I think a lot of us don't see pride as an active part of our repertoire. It's a little bit more remote. It's a little bit more vague to us in its role as a virtue, as something to do. So what I hope to do in these lectures is to sharpen our understanding of what the virtue of pride is all about. Essentially, we will be chewing pride and the constituent concept of moral perfection. In the culture around us, pride is generally loathed, and perfection is dismissed as a pipe dream. So part of our work here is simply wrenching these ideals back to their proper meaning, clearing away elements of the prevalent, distorted views of them that may have infected our own thinking. But my principal object is not simply a better theoretical understanding of pride and perfection. Really, I want to make these ideals play a more active role in our lives. We want to take them down from the shelf, the pantheon of qualities that we admire, and convert them into more vital ingredients of our daily living. So I'll attempt to reinvigorate in each of us a dedication to the practice of the virtue of pride, so that we can reap more fully its benefits, which are truly crucial benefits, as we'll see. Now, I might also mention that a better understanding of pride, I think, can help lead to a better understanding of the entire objectivist ethics. This isn't something that I anticipated, so it's not something that I had planned when I set out to do these lectures, but in working on them, in pressing some questions about perfection in particular, I found that it helped me to gain a deeper appreciation of how objective the objectivist ethics is, how it's not rationalistic. So be on the lookout for that lesson as well. And I think the material more relevant to that will occur more in tomorrow's lecture than today's. Okay, now before I get started in earnest, a little bit about the agenda. I just have to say this, it's kind of in my face, so let me see if I can move it a bit and still be heard. Let me know, okay? All right, everyone should have two handouts. One is an outline, the other is a list of quotations that I will be referring to. Our structure is pretty straightforward. I'll begin by looking at what pride is, and as you can see on the handout, on the outline, I'm giving you some breakdown of subtopics. Then we'll proceed to consider why pride is a virtue, the reason why it has that status. Then we'll investigate the particulars of what pride demands, what it is a person must do in order to practice this virtue. In a sense, you can't really separate these topics. Understanding the demands of pride is largely a fleshing out of what it is. And I might also note, we're not going to spend equal time on all of these subjects. Under this unit of what pride demands, for instance, I'm going to devote extended time to perfection. Maybe Probably roughly half of the entire 2 lectures will be dedicated simply to moral perfection. Our final subject then will be the major sources of opposition to pride. Pride and perfection don't receive a very warm welcome in our society. Something like Benjamin Franklin's overt, very explicit dedication to perfecting himself. Some of you might be aware of this. In his autobiography, he wrote about wanting to perfect himself. The typical response to that these days is a condescending chuckle, right? How naive, how quaint, how ridiculous, right? So our final question will be, what animates the animosity toward pride and perfection? One last preliminary note. After writing the lectures, I realized I should have called them moral ambition, pride, and perfection instead of the reverse. Okay, but that's what happens when you think of the course one year and then a year later actually write the thing. So our aim today is basically to reach perfection, which is not to give us too ambitious a project for today, reach perfection. But today we want to get up to perfection, and if we're really lucky, even get a little started on perfection. Okay. But let's begin by looking at what pride is. Everyone's familiar with what the feeling of pride is. Because of this, we can have trouble understanding how pride can be a virtue. A virtue, after all, is a kind of action. The kind of action by which one gains or keeps values. By extolling pride, though, Rand is not ordering us to feel a certain way. You can't make yourself feel any particular way on demand. So we simply have to recognize at the outset that there are 2 distinct phenomena, the feeling of pride and the virtue of pride. These 2 are definitely connected, but they are different things. To see the connection, let's begin by considering the feeling of pride a bit more. Pride reflects an estimate of yourself. To feel pride is to be pleased with oneself in some respect. Pride differs from joy in that the sources of pride are things for which you are responsible. You can be proud of an accomplishment or a victory, for instance. Not, though, of a stroke of good luck that is completely out of your hands. You might be proud of earning a degree or earning a position at a company after a long, sustained effort. I might be proud if, playing tennis, down love 4 in the final set, I come back to win the match, right? This doesn't happen often, but if it happens, I'm going to be very proud, right? Now, the feeling of pride stems from a positive self-evaluation based on a belief that the source of that evaluation is itself worthwhile. Displays of pride often convey more than self-approval, however. Consider a few examples. One is the celebrated refusal of Rosa Parks, the black woman living in the Jim Crow South in the 50s, to obey the bus driver's orders to go to the back of the Alabama bus. Now, that's often touted as an example of courage, and I think it is an example of courage, but I also think it shows a proud woman who practiced her ideas about her worth relative to that of whites, to the nth degree, not knowing when she defied that authority what would become of her, what would happen. This is right, she thought, so I'm going to do it. Parks' pride wouldn't permit her to subordinate herself. Another proud figure, the hero in the film and play The Great White Hope, which I hope some of you have seen, James Earl Jones, very good movie, based on a true story. The hero there, Jack Jefferson, his pride shines through his refusal to throw a boxing match in order to extricate himself from legal and financial crisis. He's thrust into an increasingly desperate situation because of unjust laws. Having adopted definite ideals of how the game should be played, though, boxing in his case, the character, Jefferson, was too dedicated to those ideals to fold. His attitude, I have certain standards and I will live up to them. Even in the more everyday arena, watching sports, watching a football game, sometimes the commentators will say, When one team is trailing miserably in a football game, for instance, well, you know, those 49ers have a lot of pride. And what do they mean? Well, they're generally trying to explain why the 49ers here are still trying hard, even though they're trailing miserably, right? They're refusing to relax their effort. They're maintaining high standards despite very discouraging circumstances. Or consider the poor person who won't beg for charity, but instead seeks work to uphold his conviction, perhaps, about the propriety of earning what one receives, of trading rather than mooching. He's exhibiting pride insofar as he is practicing his moral standards, even when it may look a lot easier not to. Now, what these examples help us to see is that pride is often more than an after-the-fact feeling. It's not merely a celebratory cigar enjoyed after some success. Such cases begin to reveal the virtue as opposed to the feeling of pride. Because in these examples, we see pride guiding conduct. It's a belief about appropriate standards, about what action is worthy of one, that drives Rosa Parks, Jack Jefferson, the athlete, the poor person, to act as they do. Now please note, I don't offer these examples as the best representatives of what the proper practice of pride is. That image, I hope, will become clearer as we proceed. But I use them to bring out this point that pride is or can be more than a feeling. It's manifested in action. And to see this more fully, let's turn now to Ayn Rand's explanation of the virtue of pride. Okay? Rand writes that pride is best characterized as moral ambitiousness. I think that's one of the most beautiful lines in all of Rand's writing. And I mean, there's a lot to choose from, certainly, but that's one of my favorites. To be proud is to set high moral standards and strive to attain them ever more fully. Rand provides a fuller description in Galt's speech, and this is printed on your handout as item A. Let's read through that. Pride is the recognition of the fact that you are your own highest value. And like all of man's values, it has to be earned. That of any achievements open to you, the one that makes all others possible is the creation of your own character. That your character, your actions, your desires, your emotions are the product of the premises held by your mind. That as man must produce the physical values he needs to sustain his life, so he must acquire the values of character that make his life worth sustaining. That as man is a being of self-made wealth, so he is a being of self-made soul. That to live requires a sense of self-value. But man, who has no automatic values, has no automatic sense of self-esteem, and must earn it by shaping his soul in the image of his moral ideal, in the image of man, the rational being he is born able to create, but must create by choice. That the first precondition of self-esteem is that radiant selfishness of soul, which desires the best in all things, in values of matter and spirit, a soul that seeks above all else to achieve its own moral perfection, valuing nothing higher than itself. Again, in the Objectivist Ethics, Rand says of pride, and this is B on your handout, it means that one must earn the right to hold oneself as one's own highest value by achieving one's own moral perfection. What is she saying? At the beginning of the long passage, you might wonder, is she treating pride as a value there, as opposed to a virtue? Look at how it begins again. Pride is the recognition of the fact that you are your own highest value. And like all of man's values, it has to be earned. So the answer is no, it's not pride that has to be earned, as she's speaking of it there. It's your life that has to be earned, the great value of your life. And that's why appropriate actions are necessary. That's why pride is necessary. Pride as a virtue, instructing you to take certain types of actions. The need for pride stems from the value of your life and from the need to make your life worthy. Notice something about this passage. It's all about the self. It says nothing really about external reality, other people, the fact that human beings need material goods to survive. Actually, it refers to that kind of parenthetically. The focus here is exclusively on the person himself. Pride is a self-absorbed virtue, you might say. Rand is taking the 19th century idea of the self-made man and breaking it down to show an aspect of its requirements that's normally overlooked. She's observing that just as we need to produce material values to sustain ourselves, to make our way in the world, we also need to produce spiritual values to achieve a certain spiritual state or condition. Rand is saying that a man's character is crafted, not inherited, and that character is really important. Of any achievements open to you, the one that makes all others possible is the creation of your own character. So the soul that we make, the character we construct, is of vital significance to our ability to live, as much as wealth is, really more so than wealth. The virtue of pride is about taking your own character seriously. In practice, this involves both intellectual and existential components, as Dr. Peikoff discusses in OPAR. First, pride means that you must work to learn what is good, to identify objective values and true moral principles. As Rand wrote, again in that same long passage, your character, your actions, your desires, your emotions are the product of the premises held by your mind. So the first thing you've got to do to be proud is get the right premises. And sometimes that does take work, especially living in a culture like ours. Then you've got to act on that knowledge, live by that knowledge, use it to guide your choices. Rand wrote that man earns a sense of self-value by shaping his soul in the image of his moral ideal. In other words, through action. That's how you shape your soul. When Rand writes in that second passage that you must achieve your moral perfection, she's saying that pride means a deliberate dedication to self-improvement, an active campaign to strengthen your character, if it's good, to change it if it's not so good. Pride means idealism directed toward yourself. You might say that it's hero worship in action, or first-person hero worship, not as admiration from afar, but in the active form of making yourself a hero. Let me now conjure a few images of pride from Atlas Shrugged. Consider Eddie as a young boy, wanting to do, he says, whatever is right. He was impressed by the minister's sermon when the minister said, we must reach for the best within us. Now those images are a little bit hazy, but that seems appropriate for a young boy who's just feeling his way in the world, getting a grip on things. But they reflect, I think, the spirit of pride. They resonate for a boy who wants to be the best self he can be, who wants to build the best character, who wants to make the most of himself. Or consider a line, the second image isn't really an image, it's a phrase that really caught my attention only about 5 years ago in one of my rereadings of Atlas. It's a phrase that comes up when Dagny is on retreat in the country after they've passed 10-289, okay, and she's at the cabin. No day was left to die behind her. Now that's said in the context of her building a path as opposed to just cooking meals, so that no day was left to die behind her. But here again, I think that sentiment reflects an ambitious spirit, wanting to grow every day, to expand one's life, to make each piece of one's life, each day of it contribute, to be building an ever better existence for oneself. Or consider Francisco, who, Rand writes, moved as if he had a cape floating behind him, who, given a family in which heirs had prided themselves on increasing d'Anconia copper's production 10%, sought to raise production 100%. There's ambition for you, right? And that is moral ambition, because money is life, as he so eloquently teaches us. Francisco, who explains that the reason that his family name remains noble is that no one in the family believes that he is born a d'Ancona. Each must become one. The nobility has to be earned. Francisco, practicing his ideals, despite the torture of hurting the people he cares most about, Dagny and Hank. Or consider Galt, the man whose face bore no mark of pain or fear or guilt. In their place, what did Dagny see when finally in the valley she opens her eyes to him? What does she see? Quote, "The shape of his mouth was pride, and more, it was as if he took pride in being proud." Close quote. And in Galt, I think, we see the connection between the feeling of pride and the virtue of pride most sharply. It is by acting as one should that a person earns the feeling of pride. So this is pride, according to Ayn Rand. Eddie wanting to be the best. Dagny wanting to make the most. Francisco, I'll raise you tenfold. Galt, I will live for my happiness. So your understanding of pride, I hope, is beginning to become clearer. We're not there yet. It's got a ways to go, but I hope it's beginning to come into a little sharper focus. Let's compare this with Aristotle's understanding of pride. Pride's greatest champion before Ayn Rand was Aristotle. He unapologetically applauded pride, and that alone is pretty rare in the history of philosophy. It has usually been vilified. Aristotle explicitly listed pride among the virtues. Indeed, he gave it special prominence. He designated pride as the crown of the virtues. What did he mean by pride? Well, he wrote, "The man is proud who thinks himself worthy of great things, being worthy of them." Pride implies greatness. He's speaking of a high level of achievement when he's talking about a proud person. A proud man's claims correspond to his deserts. In other words, the proud person has high self-regard, but deservedly so, as a result of having earned it. He's entitled to that high self-regard. Why did Aristotle call pride the crown of the virtues? Because a person couldn't have pride without having the other virtues. If he did, he'd be vain. He'd be overestimating how good a person he is. The truly proud man must be good, Aristotle wrote. He must be good in the highest degree. Aristotle held that pride magnifies the other virtues and cannot exist without them. Thus, whatever positive feelings the proud person experiences, they are warranted by his praiseworthy, virtuous activity. Now, how does this differ from Ayn Rand's explanation? I should say, how does Rand's explanation differ? Primarily in being, in Rand's explanation of pride, being more directed to the future. It's attending in a forward, future-oriented dimension. This really is the striking advance of Rand's account over Aristotle's. His account is comparatively passive. For Aristotle, pride is a self-assessment. It's a positive one, duly earned by being a good, virtuous person. So in praising pride, Aristotle is indirectly applauding the earning of the feeling of pride. But pride for Aristotle is, as I've heard Harry Binswanger put it, a type of justice. It's an honest, objective judgment of yourself. Rand recognized pride as more than that. Pride is not simply a backward gaze or a savoring of past glories. It's not simply a feeling of satisfaction with one's accomplishments, justified as such a feeling might be. Virtues are dispositions to act in particular ways, qualities of character that are manifested in action. Rand captures the unique nature of proud action, setting it apart from justice. It's the energetic, ambitious application of one's moral code. The virtue of pride is a matter of practicing proper and demanding moral standards. It is an engaged commitment to achieve one's moral excellence. We don't see that in Aristotle's account. The idea of deliberately undertaking self-improvement is absent. He didn't have, it seems, the concept really of moral ambitiousness. And certainly, he didn't recognize the value of pride as explicitly or as fully as Rand did. So, Aristotle praises pride, and he says some important true things about it, but he doesn't offer nearly as complete and definitive an understanding as Rand did, okay? You might want to ask me more about Aristotle later, okay? Feel free to ask me more about Aristotle later, and I can give you a little bit more of what Aristotle said, because there's some good stuff in Aristotle on pride, okay? But that gives you the basic, his basic picture of it and the basic difference between his account and Rand's. All right. Let me briefly say a little bit about a few common misconceptions. I've really debated, should I include these, should I skip these? Let me include them briefly. The reason I've debated is I think to a lot of us they probably sound so stupid, But, this is the world we live in and we face these kinds of ideas, so let's just quickly try to put to rest certain somewhat foolish ideas. One frequent misconception about pride is to equate pride with stubbornness. In popular imagery, the proud person is often portrayed as a hardhead, somebody who refuses to consider the possibility that he's wrong about something or that he's being unreasonable. But of course, if a person adopts this posture, pride isn't the problem. Self-honesty is the problem. You should never think your position is right just because it's your position, but that's a pretty elementary error. That sort of obstinacy reflects utter dishonesty about one's fallibility. A proud person who values honesty wouldn't permit himself to indulge in such self-deception. So there's simply no good reason to associate proper pride with stubbornness. A second misconception is the assumption that the proud person is a show-off. Proud means pompous, a boaster, not content with his own self-estimate, but who feels compelled to broadcast his feats to make sure everybody else is aware of them as well. Now, what's important here is to appreciate that a person's estimate of himself, or his genuine worth, or his moral ambitiousness, and his way of expressing it are two different things. You don't have to like parading self-congratulation in order to like or commend pride. Indeed, such conspicuous displays usually bespeak the wish to be seen by others in a certain light, and thus reveal a misplaced priority on others' opinion. There's a nice line from Cyrano de Bergerac about this. Cyrano at one point asserts, "I am too proud to be a parasite." In other words, he's too concerned with his own opinion of himself to chase after others, to try to impress others. One of the things that I think is very nice about a lot of objectivists is how they can tell you pretty impressive accomplishments, pretty impressive successes they've had, without coming across as boasting or as seeming desperate to impress you. I mean, it's kind of refreshing, but it's not the normal image of the proud person. A third prevalent misconception concerns the basis of pride. Many people assume that pride depends on comparisons with other people or the approval of other people. And a lot of philosophers over the centuries have fed this view. You can find passages in both historical and contemporary philosophers describing pride in these comparative terms. Now, this comparative conception of pride no doubt contributes to pride's unpopularity, because it converts pride into a kind of menace. Generally, humble people who present themselves in a self-deprecating light, who don't have much to be proud of, are not threatening. By contrast, the proud person often is threatening if the basis for one's self-regard is comparison with others. If you believe that the proper barometer of your worth is others' worth, and that the better other people are, or the more highly they appear to think of themselves, the less likely they are to be impressed by you, then every proud person becomes a threat to your self-esteem. Pride becomes a game of me versus you. Who's better determines who's good and who's entitled to think well of himself. Thus, many people find the company of humble people more comforting. If you think pride is a product of social comparisons, another person's pride is read as a sign of your inferiority. Now, in truth, of course, it's a proud person's self-evaluation that's pivotal. Listen to an early description of Francisco. Quote, "There was no boasting in his manner and consciousness, no thought of comparison. His attitude was not, 'I can do it better than you,' but simply, 'I can do it.' What he meant by doing was doing superlatively." Close quote. So the upshot. Pride imposes no need to compare oneself to others. A person can hold himself to high standards without assigning relative positions to others. How well one individual is living up to his moral principles does not rely on how well other people are living up to theirs. We can all be morally ambitious. All right. That's the end of the first unit. With a better understanding of what pride is, we can now turn to the next big question. What is the case for pride? What is the value of pride? Why should we be proud? Why is it a virtue? Some of the value of pride rests in the fact that it fortifies a person's other virtues. Because pride requires practicing the other virtues, it will strengthen a person's disposition to virtuous action, steadily eroding any internal obstacles. Now, this sort of muscle strengthening occurs with all virtues. The more you exercise the virtue of independence, for example, the easier it becomes, the more second nature. Being moral is a lot like physical exercise. Through repetition, you can wear down initial resistance and become stronger. The point here is that insofar as pride consists of practicing other virtues, it will fortify all of them. Correspondingly, since pride consists of perfecting one's practice of morality, pride will repay the more particular benefits of various other virtues. Pride delivers the rewards of honesty, for instance. By refusing to fake reality, a person reaps the benefits of squarely confronting facts, welcome or unwelcome, and responding on the basis of what is the case rather than what he might wish were the case. Pride delivers the rewards of justice, objective evaluations of others as your basis for dealing with them rather than some non-objective way of evaluating others. And so on with each of the various virtues. Each offers distinct rewards or value. By being proud, by committing yourself to the conscientious practice of those virtues, you will reap all of the benefits that they offer. In this sense, you might say that the value of pride is the value of all morality. It's your way of cashing in to the max. An additional element of pride's value. Recall the contrast between Aristotle's conception and Ayn Rand's. Rand identified the forward direction of pride. Recognizing pride as something beyond satisfaction with past accomplishments reveals pride's work as a spur, driving a person to be ever more virtuous, to continually sharpen his moral skills, or to more deeply automatize virtuous responses. Pride serves as an engine of morality, propelling a person's moral growth. Pride strengthens one's commitment to other moral virtues. A particular benefit from this, if you're working on being morally ambitious, setting demanding goals for yourself, this heightened sensitivity to moral issues will translate into a greater number of occasions for moral action. Pride brings an ever readier recognition of occasions on which morality is relevant and virtuous action is possible. Being more attuned, you're more likely to notice that an issue that you might have thought fell outside of the moral domain, maybe how to spend your money, I mean, by now that probably seems, of course, that's a moral issue. But at first, oh, that's a moral issue, or how I spend my Saturday morning, that's a moral issue. Well, the more ambitiously you're dedicated to practicing your morality, the more you'll be noticing that certain issues that you might not have thought were moral are moral. So they too are occasions for you to really think about what you're doing here, how to be rational, how to be just, or whatever the relevant virtue. So, if your moral radar is expanded or tuned up, or whatever it is that a radar is, if you're really exercising the virtue of pride, you'll be on the lookout for ways of doing your best. So far the benefit of pride is straightforward. It invigorates the practice of all virtues and correspondingly carries the rewards correlative to all of those other virtues. But so far this also sounds as if it might be redundant. I mean, you might have a natural question at this stage. If pride is a matter of ambitiously perfecting the practice of honesty, justice, productiveness, etc., and the value that pride offers is more of the same rewards attainable through those other virtues, is pride as a separate virtue really necessary? By the account I've given so far, you might think, it sounds like, when Rand got to pride, she ran out of gas. And all she was saying was, all she was saying with pride was, be moral, really. Or be moral and underlining it, right? Is that all there is to it? No. That was, what I've said so far, some of the value of pride. A real part and a valuable part of the value of pride, but there is importantly more to the story. One further aspect of pride's value rests in its making the implicit explicit. Of course, by advocating the other virtues, Rand is telling us to practice those virtues. But pride as a distinct virtue calls special attention to that. It puts the injunction to be virtuous up close and personal. Making the implicit explicit is valuable because it strengthens a person's likelihood to act virtuously. The more consciously you hold a belief, the more explicitly you identify a directive to yourself, the more difficult it is to violate it. The more likely you are to notice yourself about to breach it. If an instruction is kept a little bit hazy, a little bit amorphous, it's easier to let immoral actions slip through. We find this in everyday behavior. If you tell yourself vaguely, I'm going to start that diet one of these days, it's a lot easier to tuck into a big stack of pancakes the next morning than if you had said, I resolve to start tomorrow morning, and nothing the least bit sweet. So, the maple syrup is out of here, right? Nothing the least bit sweet all day. Well, by making it more explicit and more specific, it's going to be harder for you to cheat. It's not going to make it impossible, but the strain is going to be more visible to you and harder to overcome. Now, pride, by reminding you to be perfect, performs the same sort of service. It's helpful to underscore the need to act morally. So this is another facet of pride's value, making the implicit explicit. But we still haven't named the core of its value, its most important contribution to our lives. To see that, notice that every virtue that Rand identifies is grounded in a specific fact. Her account of each virtue in Galt's speech begins by citing that that virtue is a recognition of the fact that such and such. There's some specific aspect of reality that calls for this virtuous type of action as necessary if man is to live. Look back at your handout at passage A again. The beginning of that. Pride is the recognition of the fact that you are your own highest value. And like all of man's values, it has to be earned. A bit later in the passage, she writes, he must acquire the values of character that make his life worth sustaining. What Rand is observing is this. It's the fact that man is a being of self-made soul that creates the need to make ourselves well. Even more specifically, it's the fact that we are volitional beings we control our thoughts and actions, and the fact that an individual's choices affect him as well as the world around him. Through your actions, you are shaping external reality and shaping yourself, your character. So self-awareness plays an important role here. The fact that you are self-aware and that awareness of the kind of person you have made yourself matters to how you will act. The virtue of pride reflects the fact that we are conscious, and our consciousness of ourselves is critical to our success in life. Aware that I have free will, that I control my thoughts and actions, I must develop a good reputation with myself as a person I can trust to take good care of myself. I must think well of myself in order to act well and prosper. My estimate of my actions, of my history, of my character, of me, will influence what I seek, what I go for, as well as how hard I try, what I encourage myself to do, what I allow myself to do, what I demand of myself. So all of this leads us to appreciate the special, distinctive value to be gained through the virtue of pride, self-esteem. And I think we should take some time to try to appreciate this value. Pride nourishes self-esteem. Pride is the precondition for self-esteem. I refer again to passage A. Now about 10 lines down, if you want to try to locate this. It's about 10 lines down, midway between the left and the right margins. Rand writes, that to live requires, if you can find that to live requires a sense of self-value. But man who has no automatic values has no automatic sense of self-esteem and must earn it by shaping his soul in the image of his moral ideal. In other words, we need self-esteem and we must earn it. It's not a given. This is what pride allows us to do, earn our own self-respect. Elsewhere in Galt's speech, Rand identifies 3 supreme values: reason, purpose, self-esteem. She also writes that, quote, no value is higher than self-esteem, close quote. In Opar, Dr. Peikoff says that pride is the only means to self-esteem. If so, that makes pride pretty damn valuable, right? Now notice, that's a nice deductive argument. It says, if Rand and Peikoff are right, then we've got a really tidy case for the value of pride, right? But are they right? You know, you always have to check up on those two, don't you? Rand and Peikoff, you always have to check up on those two. So, let's check. Let's backtrack a little bit and look at reality to see. To start, what is self-esteem? Sometimes we use the term generically to mean a person's basic estimate of himself, be it positive or negative, whether he has high or low self-esteem. Other times we use it to refer to a favorable evaluation of oneself, and henceforth that's how I'll use it in the positive sense, okay? That's how Dr. Peikoff uses it in Opar. He says that self-esteem is a fundamental, positive moral appraisal of oneself. Self-esteem is considered self-approval of the way that you're leading your life, of the person you've made yourself. Self-esteem encapsulates the twin convictions, I am able to live and I am worthy of living. It's a positive assessment of your competence and of your value. Now, why is self-esteem important? Why is it such a major value? If pride's value rests in delivering self-esteem, we have to understand the value of self-esteem. Start by noticing a general fact about action. Action requires motivation. How do you motivate? Through values. People won't act, let alone act rationally, for no good reason. They've got to believe that by acting, they'll get something worthwhile in return. You can't motivate action unless you think the aim or the object of your action is worthwhile. I can't motivate you to pay attention unless you think there's something valuable to get out of it, that there's some payoff. A person can't get himself to do anything unless he thinks it's worth doing, that the action has a purpose worth serving. Now, back to self-esteem. A positive view of oneself is necessary to the will to live and to one's sense of worthiness to live, and to acting accordingly. A person needs to value himself to take morality seriously, and to consider it important that he abide by it. If a person didn't value himself, what reason would he have to adhere to any particular moral regimen? He needs a minimum of self-regard to consider his actions sufficiently significant to matter. If a person is indifferent to himself or down on himself, he'll lack the values that motor motivation, the values necessary to lead him to act in a way necessary to promote his life. A morality aimed at individual happiness particularly requires the belief in one's worthiness of happiness. Now, I do want to clarify here. I want to be careful about this. The point isn't self-esteem is necessary to take morality seriously, and that's good because morality is an end in itself. That would be intrinsicism. Rather, the thought is, self-esteem is necessary to take your life seriously. And if you do, then conscientiously abiding by a rational moral code is the only way of advancing your life. Morality is your means of living. A person who does value himself will adhere to living morally as a hungry baby clutches at food, or a shipwrecked man clings to a raft. Morality is your life saver and life propeller. It is man's means of survival. So the point is, you've got to be moral. You've got to pursue your self-interest in order to live. You won't have the requisite motivation to do that if you don't have self-esteem. Remember some of the basic facts creating the need for the virtue of pride. We are volitional and self-aware. Because of these facts, every action that a person takes, in addition to whatever else it accomplishes, whatever changes it affects in the external world, contributes to a person's self-image. You know that you chose that action and that you could have chosen otherwise. You know whether it was rational or evasive on your part. We also learn over time that our lives depend on our actions, that our choices and actions have direct and momentous impact on our successes and failures, our happiness or our frustration. We learn that we have to make choices and that we have to make good choices in order to achieve our values and maintain our lives. Everything we cherish hinges on our ability to secure these things. Consequently, a person needs to develop the sense that he can rely on himself to make good choices, knowing, I'll be rational. I am rational. And that is the greatest source of self-confidence. So again, man needs to think himself able and worthy to live. If he doesn't, he won't bother doing what he must do in order to live. And I think this is why Rand said that no value is higher than self-esteem. Remember the other two chief values, right? Reason, purpose, and self-esteem. Well, it's self-esteem that gives you reason or motivation to exercise reason and to pursue a purpose. So, after this excursion into the value of self-esteem, let's bring pride back into the picture. A person needs to think himself able and worthy to live. Pride addresses that need. For the higher one's moral goals, and the more consistent one's practiced dedication to them, the greater one's sense of efficacy will grow, the stronger one's self-confidence, and the more secure one's self-esteem. Pride encourages moral action, which in turn nourishes a belief in one's goodness. That belief reinforces one's commitment to moral action, thereby strengthening one's moral character. The practice of pride thus enables a person honestly to think of himself as fit to live, able to act as he should, and to achieve all the rewards of doing so. Pride helps a person build self-esteem, which results from proud action. That self-esteem, in turn, nourishes higher standards and thus encourages still further proud action. So a mutually reinforcing dynamic develops between virtuous action and consequent self-esteem, escalating the levels of each. So, to sum up this segment, what's the value of pride? It definitely offers the values I began the section citing. It redoubles the benefits that are offered by the other virtues. It heightens sensitivity to moral issues. It makes the commitment to morality more explicit and thus more likely to actually be lived up to. But the additional unique value that pride offers is self-esteem. To live requires a sense of self-value, Rand wrote. A fundamental conviction of one's worth is essential to one's acting in ways that will achieve one's happiness. The only means of sustaining that conviction, and thus of achieving values that one's life and happiness require, is through an ongoing commitment to a rational morality, to perfecting one's moral character, through a course of moral ambitiousness. All right, so that's the end of the second unit. But again, there's lots more in the remaining units. If pride is moral ambitiousness, what are its specific components? What are the mechanics of practicing this virtue? What is pride telling us to do? What kinds of actions does the virtue of pride require? Dr. Peikoff writes that pride is a process of making one's soul properly. But how do you do that? That's our next subject, what pride demands. And again, in answering this question, we're really fleshing out what pride is. We're making that more substantial. Clearly, pride requires conscientiousness. A proud person takes his values seriously. He has adopted definite ideas of right action, and he comports himself accordingly. The adoption of a moral code is not just a theoretical verbal commitment. It's a living, breathing part of this person's metabolism, guiding his use of his mind every day, every hour. When a business boasts that it is serving you with pride, right, as you sometimes see, I know cabs in Austin are just smeared with stickers telling you, serving you with pride, okay? What does it mean when a business boasts this, right? What is it trying to communicate? Not simply, we think very highly of ourselves. Rather, it's pronouncing its dedication to high standards. It's attempting to distinguish itself from the competitors who allegedly take less care in their work. We sometimes refer to a person's taking pride in his appearance, or in his home, or in his children, or in his work. This taking pride isn't passive, however. It's not, again, a matter of just sitting back and admiring oneself. It bespeaks a commitment to a certain code of conduct. It means that rigorous standards govern his activities in those domains. When a person possesses the moral virtue of pride, the domain of firm standards is much wider. It's the domain of morality itself. Correspondingly, there are certain things that the proud person will not do. Certain actions are beneath him, such that he wouldn't even contemplate them as viable options. He won't violate his moral principles. He wouldn't accept favors, for instance, that violate legitimate rules. He wouldn't cut deals to make money or gain a position if those deals required dishonesty. In conflict with other people, a proud person would not back down for no good reason. Now, beyond this kind of conscientiousness, let me move on to observe a few more things that the proud person will do, its more positive demands. I noted a few minutes ago that this virtue is completely oriented around oneself. Correspondingly, pride demands knowing thyself, introspection, to a much greater degree than the other virtues. Being perfect relies on candid self-assessment. It demands ongoing monitoring of yourself, your choices, the extent to which you are or aren't practicing your moral code. It demands paying attention actively and a frank reckoning of where you are morally and where you need to go. So in that vein, I want to assign some homework for tomorrow. Always the way to endear yourself, right? Between today and tomorrow, take inventory of yourself morally. How virtuous are you? To what extent do you practice rationality and all of the other virtues? Think about your values. Are you tending your values well? And think about the things that you would list as your topmost values. Several, but think about your values. Are you really giving them the attention, the time, the effort that they deserve? Are you neglecting any? Now, most of you, I imagine, are not prone to major moral sins, but maybe some minor ones. Right? Things you brush off is not that big a deal. Maybe it's a matter of tending to sleep too late, or watch too much TV, or get too wrapped up in your friends' problems and you get distracted and give that too much time and you don't spend enough time on your own other higher values. Maybe you've got a couple of pet foibles, areas where you don't try as hard as you should, or you don't even fully realize that you're indulging in immorality, non-virtuous action. So be on the lookout for that sort of thing as well, okay? You want to identify areas where improvement is needed. Now, identify areas where you're strong as well, okay? And let yourself feel good about that. I don't want to just emphasize the negative here. But insofar as pride concerns being better, being your best, it naturally calls for identifying areas where we're a little weak. And I simply want to encourage you to put this demand of pride into immediate practice by looking for areas that you could stand to improve on. Okay, so really try to conduct a methodical inquiry, examining how perfect you are or aren't. Go up and down the various virtues, think about them, think about the kinds of situations that you tend to be in your particular life, in your job, with your family relationships and so on. What kinds of issues arise? How do you respond? Think about particular incidents, think about broader trends. Be honest with yourself. Be fair to yourself. Be objective, okay? Obviously, this threatens to disturb the peace, right? This threatens to, disturb the comfortable attitude that you might have settled into with yourself. And I don't mean to say that, I'm sure you guys have never done this or never thought about doing it. I know that a lot of you do this very well, and the more you do it, that's great, terrific. But again, this is what it means to take ideas seriously, including the ideas of Rand's moral philosophy. So this kind of introspective homework is a vital part of strengthening the practice of the virtue in our lives. What's important to appreciate is that introspection is indispensable to the virtue of pride. Pride gives you a mission, creating a person of unblemished self-esteem, a spotless soul. You can't achieve that mission without knowing where you stand in relation to that ideal and what you have to work on. Okay? All right. A third thing that pride demands is ambition. Now, the phrase moral ambitiousness resonates with an inspiring Rorkean spirit, but what does that mean in everyday practice? Especially if you're a good objectivist. Being honest and just and independent and productive and maintaining your integrity, right? You might think, what more can I do? How does ambition shine in? Well, first, we have to understand what ambition is. Ambition signifies the dedicated and tenacious pursuit of challenging goals. Rand defined ambition as systematic pursuit of achievement and of constant improvement in respect to one's goals. Pride is the adoption of that policy toward oneself, toward one's life. It's seeking to make the most of yourself, to get the best for yourself, the best of your values, of those things that enrich your happiness. A proud person has clearly identified values and makes high demands of himself. He'll be alert to the moral ramifications of the decisions that crop up in his day, poised to act on his principles, because he knows that that's the ticket to his values. Immorality for objectivists, again, will not often result, well, it will not often rest so much in brazen defiance of morality, but from not fully recognizing certain decisions as having moral significance. So a way of being more moral is by inspecting your options more thoroughly, being more vigilantly anti-evasion, on guard to catch yourself when you're lulled into not recognizing the significance of something that you're doing. A further aspect of being morally ambitious is by refusing to coast, refusing to vegetate. The proud person doesn't resign himself to flaws in his character, but he works to overcome specific weaknesses. He doesn't even resign himself to being okay or pretty good. Proud person strives to be his best. So another way to be morally ambitious, tell yourself to stretch, seek to attain new elevations of character, push the envelope. Now, how can you do that? I mean, that's nice, but that's a little vague, a little metaphorical. Well, one way you can do that is by giving yourself specific projects. Set out on a deliberate campaign to understand some aspect of the objectivist morality better. Maybe there's something that you realize isn't really crystal clear to you. Remember both dimensions of pride, the intellectual and the existential. Use something like the introspection homework to identify aspects of the ethics that maybe you don't fully understand. And then you can set out on a deliberate campaign to understand better justice or sanctioning evil or the issue of compromise and when it is or isn't justified, okay? As well as identifying specific virtues where you think, I'm not as independent as I need to be, or I get a little emotional when I should be more just, or whatever it might be. I mean, you can give yourself that kind of specific ongoing mission. And through that kind of targeted campaign, you can raise the bar of what you demand of yourself, and in that way elevate your character. The need for pride reflects the fact that life is not static. Life is motion, forward or backward. Treading water won't cut it. You need to grow. You need to get better. Why? Because survival is an ongoing issue. Having solved its challenges yesterday doesn't take care of today or tomorrow. Living is problem solving. And the problem of survival has to be solved every day. Each morning, action is called for. Again, however virtuous you are, however virtuously you've acted in the past, we continually encounter new particulars, new concrete situations. This boss, this colleague, this client, my relationship with this woman, or this child who's different from your first child. Now you've got this illness, or this financial constriction, or this new government regulation or company policy, or this audience, or whatever it might be. Each situation, each decision calls for your best, the best you can be now. Another important reason why we need to expand our virtue and grow, you need to continue to earn your own self-respect. Self-esteem isn't a prize that's acquired and then set aside, like a trophy that you can safely put up on a pedestal. We continue to act every day. How we act establishes the character of our soul and the esteem in which we hold it. So the upshot is you can't afford to settle. Okay. All right, I'd like to go on just a few more minutes. Okay, I still definitely will have some time for questions today, but I think I would like to get started on the topic we've avoided so far. Okay, the most intimidating aspect of this whole thing, perfection. We can put it off no longer. I'm anxious to get to it, okay? In that first long passage from Galt's speech, in referring to the precondition of self-esteem as the radiant selfishness of soul which desires the best in all things, Rand maintains that seeking the best is necessary for self-esteem. Seeking the best is not overkill. It's not a matter of being an overachiever. When she claims in the objectivist ethics that one must earn the right to hold oneself as one's own highest value by achieving one's own moral perfection, she's saying that nothing short of perfection will suffice. And Rand generally meant what she said, right? I mean, if she said perfection, she wasn't just sensationalizing to get our attention, okay? So we do want to devote extended discussion to this requirement of pride. It's a concept that's particularly mired in distortions of a non-objective context, so there's a lot of clarifying to do. And further, I think it's in understanding perfection and the importance of perfection and the importance of embracing it as an achievable ideal. It's through this, I think, that we can also see some of those other benefits in terms of appreciating how objective and practical the objectivist ethics is. So let's begin by explaining what perfection is. Etymologically, the word's roots lie in the term facere, meaning to do or to make, and per, P-E-R, suggesting thoroughly. The dictionary would tell us that to perfect something is to bring it to completion or full development, or to make faultless. And this is reflected in many of our everyday ways of using the term. When you describe two lines as not perfectly parallel, you mean that they are not exactly or wholly parallel. A perfect fool has been utterly senseless. A perfectly innocent remark is completely innocent, without any sinister intentions. A perfect evening, a perfect vacation, a perfect host, a perfect fit meets the highest relevant ideals. It needs no improvement. Perfect vision, or perfect SAT score, designates flawlessness in the measured abilities or domain, or performance. Something was done to perfection. The veal was roasted, the role was played, when it achieves the highest levels of excellence. Harry Binswanger, in his article The Possible Dream, several years ago in the Objectivist Forum, gave us an excellent definition that essentializes this sort of observation. And I've given you this on the handout as item C. Perfection designates the flawlessly complete satisfaction of a standard of value. The perfect is the best possible in a given domain. It is the finest specimen or performance that it is rational to seek or expect. Notice what this implies about a person who is morally perfect. He doesn't perform actions that are different in kind from the actions of lesser people. Rather, what distinguishes the morally perfect person is unusual consistency and discipline in adhering to morality's guidance. The perfect person's commitment to morality is unflinching. He unfailingly follows the instruction that his moral principles provide. Confronted with any decision, he is guided by those principles. When questions or doubts infect his consideration of a proposed course of action, he pursues them rather than evades them. He doesn't allow impulse, mood, desire, emotion, popularity, tradition, any other peripheral temptation to veto the verdicts of his moral code. The morally perfect person acts as his moral code prescribes, day in, day out, decision after decision. Now, so far I hope clear enough. But given the distorted ideas of perfection that are so widespread around us, let's try to plant our conception of it a little bit more firmly by noting a few things that perfection is not. Perfection is not, well, let's put it this way. Perfection is a quality of a person's moral character rather than his metaphysical nature. Many people think of perfection as a sort of ontological status, as if there's something in your blood or genes, or it's a kind of birthmark that distinguishes a person as a superior breed. That image is typically associated with God, something that is allegedly by nature all perfect. What Rand is advocating, however, is a normative ideal, a moral goal that's open to and attainable by everyone, anyone. It depends exclusively on how a person leads his life. Moral perfection is wholly a function of a person's free and voluntary actions. Correspondingly, to say that a person is morally perfect does not mean that he's morally infallible, incapable of taking wrong actions. Perfection is not the attainment of some beatific state insulated from the ordinary struggles of decision-making. Perfection bespeaks a moral commitment so deeply engraved as to make immoral action unlikely. This is a prediction based on an individual's past, however, rather than the assertion of that person's predetermination. The fact that a person has done no wrong doesn't entail that he can do no wrong. A person's character is built up of countless discrete choices. A person always remains capable of deviating from the moral course. Thus, attributing perfection to a person never means that he's finished, he's cooked, right? That quest to be moral is completed and he can move on to other concerns. Morality is ongoing. A person's character is shaped, strengthened, or weakened through his choices each day. It's also important to appreciate that doing one's best does not ensure the achievement of excellent outcomes. We can't control the results of our actions, however rationally and virtuously we might act. Certainly, when you're pursuing rational values, it's better for people not only to try their hardest, but to succeed at what they're trying to do. But success is not what we're measuring when we discuss moral perfection. The virtue of pride, with its demand for perfection, urges people to practice morality consistently and ambitiously. In assessing perfection, we are exclusively judging whether or not the person does so. So it's important not to confuse the issue by introducing extraneous factors. Perfection is virtuous because it greatly enhances your chances of success in life, but success is not the litmus test of whether or not you are perfect. Okay. Finally, one more clarification here. In demanding moral perfection, pride is not advocating perfectionism of the neurotic sort. I mean, we often describe a person as a perfectionist to criticize him, right? It's an insult or a slur. And sometimes legitimately so. I mean, sometimes people criticize the perfectionist out of envy, out of resentment of the good. But sometimes what we mean when we call a person in a disparaging way a perfectionist, and I mean, you or I may be less inclined to use it this way, but often what people mean is that perfectionist he's lost perspective on sensible priorities, right? He's obsessed with comparatively insignificant aspects of a project. Or he fails to complete tasks due to unrealistically high standards. Well, those are not good traits, but those are not what Rand is advocating. And notice that in those cases, the person's flaw is not in his concern with doing a good job. The problem rests in his skewed idea of what a good job is. The neurotic perfectionist's actions are not based on a rational grasp of how he should act. So while there are problems with that sort of neurotic perfectionism, they provide no grounds for doubting the propriety of rationally seeking to perfect one's moral character. Okay. I think at that point I should probably stop so we have some time for questions today, and we'll carry on with perfection tomorrow. So, questions? Hi, yes.
I've always been interested in the issue of how self-conscious a person should be about their moral stature. I'll try to concretize it a little bit. I never had the impression that Ayn Rand went around saying to herself, gosh, I'm the most moral person, isn't this tremendous? But it was more kind of quiet awareness of it. And great businessmen that I've met don't seem to be self-conscious about their virtue. They know it, but it's not as though they're making it a big issue with themselves and telling themselves, gosh, I'm so virtuous, this is great.
Right.
And yet, from what you said, you need to be self-aware because you don't want to violate your virtues. And so it's a kind of a subtle thing is how you hold in your mind the issue of your own virtue. So I wonder if you had any opinion about that.
I do have thoughts on that, and I plan to say something on that tomorrow, actually, because that very question occurred to me. So, of course, I think it's a fascinating question. How self-conscious does one need to be? Under after talking a lot more about perfection, I'm going to talk a little bit about implementation, and I have that very question on the agenda, so maybe I'll just put it off until then, and if I don't adequately address it, feel free to raise it again, because I do think it's a very interesting one in terms of how we individually are really supposed to put this into practice. Okay?
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk, Tara. I found that when people pursue a virtue by a duty, meaning I must be moral, that it totally undermines them. And what I love about Ayn Rand's entire philosophy is that if they pursue it as a value, if they feel like they're a kid in a toy store, where every place they turn, being virtuous is fun, enjoyable, a pleasure, a relief, it reduces the mental load, it helps them with contradictions. And I wondered if you could address that point in terms of how to hold it as a value rather than as a thou shalt be moral.
I think that's a very good point. And I don't know that I have a lot to say on it, in particular, just in relation to pride. But certainly, there are times when, for instance, in speaking, in giving the lecture that I just gave, where I'll refer periodically to, it's selfish, it's in your interest. And there are times when I think, they know that, they know the objectivist morality is all about self-interest. But in a sense, that's me trying to continually anchor this virtue, this thing that we should do, to the value, the payoff. So, I would certainly, I think you're 100% right, and I know just in my own personal case, it's turning around those duties that I accepted just as duties, things you should do, because they're right, period, stop, end of story, into things you should do because they're good for you. They're going to add to your life, You're going to have even more fun if you... But getting that does take really understanding the necessity, the propriety of the virtues that Ayn Rand has identified. If you haven't really digested how being rational is your ticket to living and to living happily, how being honest is your ticket, or being just is your ticket. You really have to digest the moral principles as all serving these values. Then you can remind yourself and it can be effective. If you haven't really digested the principle's practicality in the first place, then I think you're going to have a harder time convincing yourself in a given incident, oh yeah, it's the value payoff here. But I think it's always good just to remind us, as you just did, of none of these things are ends in themselves. None of these virtues are ends in themselves. And I know a lot of us, even after we've consciously recognized that and said that to ourselves dozens of times, still find remnants of perhaps a different kind of morality that we were raised on in there. So I guess I don't have anything more really to add than that. Maybe by tomorrow something else will come in relation to pride, but
Two somewhat related questions. Would you comment on the issue of taking pride in one's external accomplishments as opposed to moral character? And secondly, the question of taking pride in a child or friend's accomplishment.
Okay, good, interesting question. In terms of taking pride in your own external accomplishments, I would think that insofar as they're your accomplishments, what you're proud of, pleased with, applauding, is the fact that you exerted the effort, depending on the case, the initiative, the persistence, whatever it might have taken, the integrity to accomplish this thing, right? To do it, to stay with it, to conceive the plan, to pursue it. It might have been a difficult thing. So there's an objective achievement out there you might point to. My company made this much money this year, or whatever it might be, right? And you're proud of that because you did it, or you spearheaded it, or whatever. So I think that's an extension of pride in oneself. Now that is a kind of pride that other people, non-objectivists, are much more familiar with and to some extent content with. I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow too, other people's attitudes toward perfection, toward pride in general. The other kind of case you raise, taking pride in another person, is an interesting one, and originally I was going to say a little bit about this. I think it's a little tricky. We do speak of taking pride in, your husband or wife's accomplishment, your children's accomplishment, a teammate, something like that. And I think that's okay. I think we should notice something. Taking pride in another person requires a certain license. You've got to be in some way closely associated with that person, or perhaps with their accomplishment. You've got to be in on it in some way. I can't be proud of what a stranger does. I mean, perhaps in some very loose way, I might be proud of the human race when they do something great, okay? But basically, you know, I'll be proud of someone to whom I have some fairly close relationship, or maybe it's, you know, a child. Well, I'm the one who gave them the values, perhaps, or tried to raise them on certain values, and now this great accomplishment that they've just achieved is an outgrowth or reflection of something that I was in on or part of. So I think that even when we take pride in another person, you've got to have been in on it in some way, however indirect, however remote, and that's what licenses the feeling of pride as opposed to just a feeling of admiration that I might have for someone who does a great thing. But for instance, there are people here, some of whom I don't know at all. I mean, even of the people I know, there are a lot of their accomplishments that I can't take any pride in. I can think that's terrific and hope that they feel pride, but there is this kind of possessive element that I think is necessary for pride. Okay. Yes.
Would you distinguish between integrity and pride in the taxi example? How is the company's living up to its own standards showing integrity, and how is it showing pride?
Well, if the company is living up to its own standards, that's good, and that's a case of integrity. I think the question of the relationship between integrity and pride is a very good one. Do you mind if I answer it a little bit more broadly than just in regard to the taxi cabs? Okay. I think there is a similarity between the two virtues, because in a sense they're both meta-virtues, or virtues about other virtues. Integrity is loyalty to rational principles, loyalty to your values, loyalty to your convictions, right? And of course, I look back at the discussion of integrity in OPAR before coming, and the emphasis there is really on man as an integrated being, mind and body. You are one. So the convictions of your mind, the principles that you claim to accept, have got to be integrated and reflected in your actions. And a further emphasis is on the evil of compromise. I mean, integrity is really about getting how you have to live by your principles and not be weakened by the temptations of pressures, internal or external pressures, Dr. Peikoff talks about, right? So it's getting that you need to stick by your principles, that compromise is not going to get you anywhere. And you'll notice in OPAR there's extended discussion of compromise in regard to that issue of integrity. With pride, I think the emphasis is a little bit different. Pride is not so much about maintaining, this integrated being between my convictions and my practices. It's about pushing forward, right? It's moral ambitiousness. It's being better, being your best. So part of the way I think of the difference, and again, I'm admitting there is a similarity here because they both concern really practicing all of those other virtues. Part of the way I think of the difference is, I'm not sure this is really perfect, but I think of it this way. It's like integrity is about maintaining, and it's sort of horizontal, and pride is more vertical. It's the upward striving. So I think you get more of that with pride, okay?
There's currently a lot of talk about self-esteem in our culture, and it seems to me very often attended by quite a bit of misunderstanding. And in trying to get my own understanding a little bit precise, I kind of encounter a kind of circularity here. It seems that on one hand, we make the statement that a person must value himself in order to want to act morally. In other words, self-esteem is sort of a precondition. And then we talk about self-esteem as a favorable moral assessment of oneself, or as sort of a reward for being virtue. So it looks like we're saying you need self-esteem in order to act to get self-esteem. Mm-hmm. I've tentatively kind of resolved it by saying to myself, well, you need this basic self-esteem to sort of want to be motivated to be moral, and then if you are successful in that, then it is reinforced. That self-esteem is reinforced by the act of being moral. So, I wonder if you could.
Well, I mean, I think that both do indeed operate. I think it's a good question you're asking. It's kind of chicken or egg question, yeah. Which comes first? And I think a certain basic self-regard has to come first in terms of a person's doing anything. And in a way, I think this is related to Ellen Kenner's question about values, right? If values are the things that motivate action, you have to have some sense of, yeah, my life, this is a valuable thing, this is a good thing, in order to even get going. Now, as a pretty young child, you're not even going to have the concept of self-esteem. You might have some self-esteem already going on, right? It might not be, I mean, God, if you're in a healthy household, it might not yet have even occurred to you to doubt a certain amount of self-esteem, right? But from a very early age, you've got to have values. You've got to value your own experience in order to think, yeah, I want that toy. Or yeah, I want that ice cream, or whatever it might be. Or I want to play on that swing. So there's a certain valuing of other things that indirectly reflects a valuing of yourself that I think has got to be there in the first place to go after things. Then through experience, as you become more and more self-aware and aware of the kind of self you're making yourself, the kind of character you're building, you'll, I think, notice that if you're doing what you think you should do, being rational, adhering to the principles that you espouse, you'll be developing a stronger, more positive, robust sense of yourself, and that, I think, would work in the way I talked about in terms of escalating the standards you hold for yourself, what you would consider beneath you, and then I think you'd get into that nice cycle of, kind of a virtuous cycle of upping the ante and thinking of yourself more positively as a result, and that having the effect of upping the ante still further.
Thank you.
Please tell us what else Aristotle had to say about pride.
Thank you. Because a couple of things about Aristotle that you might be interested in or you might not be if you're just being polite. All right, let me fill in a little more of the Aristotle story. Aristotle, as I'm sure a lot of you know, spoke of all of the virtues as means between extremes. He said there's a virtuous, correct degree of a certain activity or of a certain feeling, and that's the virtue, and there are vices that are at the extreme. So courage, for instance, is having the right amount of fear, not too much, not too little. With pride is a matter of seeking honor, he thought, as opposed to the vices of being vain or small-minded, or in some translations, being unduly humble. Now, seeking honor, does that mean he just wanted praise? He thought the proud person went around seeking, to be impressive to others? Well, no, he's a little bit ambiguous on this, but there are a few places where Aristotle says the proud person seeks honor from the right people or in the right degree. So, he's not turning into Peter Keating here, okay? All right. Interesting thing. Right after Aristotle discusses pride, the very next chapter, he discusses what he calls a nameless virtue. He doesn't give it a name. It's a nameless virtue. But it's just like pride, except that it's about a person who seeks honor in more modest things. So it's about more middling, less significant affairs. But that seems to be the only difference between this nameless virtue and pride. The interesting thing is when he talks about the nameless virtue, he mentions ambition. When I first came across this, I thought, ooh, is this a quirky translation that I have? But then I went to one of the more widely used translations, W.D. Ross, a real classic for many decades, and indeed, this term ambition is used again a few times. So there, a couple of things. A, it seems the germ of a more activist interpretation of pride in Aristotle. And B, you can't help but wonder if maybe Rand read this, and that was part of what sparked her explanation of pride. Now, having said that, I have to add, still, in Aristotle's account, in both of the nameless virtue and pride, when he talks about what pride is, he talks about it as a matter of having a proper estimate of oneself. He even says that the correlative vices, being unduly humble or being vain, are not so much malicious but mistaken, suggesting it's a cognitive issue, suggesting again that it's more just this matter of, am I judging myself justly? So he really doesn't seem to have the fully activist, ambitious sense that Rand explicated, okay? And again, definitely he doesn't talk about the value of pride, the way it serves self-esteem and how important self-esteem is, as Rand did, okay? And the other thing to bear in mind with Aristotle is this whole doctrine of the mean in regard to all of the virtues, pride included, is one of the real weak links in what is a wonderful moral theory, but this is a really weak part of his theory. So he doesn't do a good job of justifying any of the virtues, and that applies to pride as well. Okay? Thanks for letting me clarify on that, though. Okay, out of time?